Laid down as the third of the Littorio-class battleships, Impero is perhaps the most interesting of the bunch, though not necessarily in the best of ways. Never completed and put through a veritable conga line of poor executive decisions, the ship would end World War II as a husk that would be scrapped well before her sisters without ever seeing proper service. Now, how did it get to this point, you may ask? Well, that is a long and interesting story, for all that it ended badly for the poor ship in question. Impero. I'm going to apologize to Italians in the audience for butchering their language at multiple points in this video. In the hopes of not sounding like someone breaking glass in their ears, I'll just stick with Impero for the pronunciation, which is probably wrong, but I'm not Italian by any stretch of the imagination. The third of her class, Impero, was laid down in May of 1938 in Genoa, a few months before Roma. For those familiar with the ships, that should explain why I'm insisting on calling her the third of her class, when most would probably go with fourth. Roma was, I suppose, the third to be completed, but she was the fourth to be laid down and launched. So it really comes down to, do you take laid down and launched, or take completion when you're calling these ships? I'm going with laid down and launched, so Impero is the third one. It's also where we get to the first in the long line of missteps with Impero. Before that, though, a bit of a technical background on the class. As I will do a full video on the Littorio class at a later date, this will be the minimum needed to understand the ships, more than a detailed breakdown. The last Italian battleships to be completed, the Littorios were large, 45,000 tons-ish, full load, though it varied between the sisters, armed with 3 triple 15-inch, 381mm for non-Americans in the audience, gun turrets, and heavily armored, in a somewhat unique way that I'll get into in their own video, because their armor scheme definitely does need to be covered in more detail. These ships were fast battleships designed for roughly 30 knots, though again it varies. They were, in most ways, the final word in Italian warship design. Heavy armor, fast, and equipped with guns which most navies would consider insanely high velocity. Again, though, I'll get into more detail on the ships themselves at a later date. Back to Impero, the builders at Ansaldo, probably butchering that pronunciation too, had predicted she could be launched in early October 1939 in a fairly fast construction time compared to her elder sisters. They'd worked out most of the quirks building the first two ships, so the second pair were easier to build. This would be delayed to November, though, for 2 reasons. First, the bane of all projects in a dictatorship, the ego of the dictator. The launch was requested, I say requested, but let's be honest, we both know how that went, to be delayed to the end of October to coincide with the anniversary of the March on Rome, so big boy Mussolini could proceed over the ceremony. Classic political move there, eh? Of course, the second delay came about because of foul weather that likely would have delayed her launch anyway, but it's still not exactly a great start for Impero there. Once she had been launched, as attentive viewers will have noticed from the date, World War II had already begun. At this point, it was not quite a world war, depending on one's view of the Sino-Japanese War, and Italy was still theoretically neutral. So she would have begun fitting out operations, continuing into the next spring, safe in the knowledge that she wouldn't be bombed or anything along those lines, until it became apparent that Mussolini's ego would rear its ugly head again, and Italy would soon go to war for their place at the table. At that point, and acknowledging that France was not quite so obviously going to fall, at least quickly, the Italian Naval Command had the somewhat reasonable concern of Allied bombers hitting Genoa in the incomplete Impero, with the only other real option being completion in Trieste? Again, I apologize to all Italians for probably butchering their language. Impero was prepared for towing to the other side of Italy. This was a rather lengthy process with the need to make a ship that had yet to even have boilers fitted into something resembling watertight, but it was done. And the ship would set out. Arriving in Brindisi in June of 1940, by this point it was rather obvious that France was doomed. Which is where the rather reasonable move becomes something more of another misstep with poor Impero. Had the ship remained in Genoa, it is pretty unlikely the French Navy or Air Force would have been able to do any significant raids prior to the fall of France. And the ship would likely have been completed at least as quickly as her sister Roma was. As it was, the Italian command decided to keep her in Brindisi, pending what must have seemed a quick surrender of the Allied powers as Britain stood alone. Yeah, this naturally didn't happen, and with the Royal Navy making the waters around Italy rather dangerous for towing a giant target across the peninsula, a process that probably would have taken about 8 days, it was decided to leave Impero in place. Some creative minds decided they could finish her at least enough to steam to Trieste. This was ambitious, to say the least. After all, Brindisi lacked anything resembling the facilities for such a task. Even so, the decision was made, and a Herculean effort began to get the ship into something resembling the condition to sail. This would require shipping her power plant, barring a couple boilers already aboard but not connected, by sea and by land. No, I'm not joking. Parts of her power plant were literally carried across northern Italy, including her reduction gears, so large that special contraptions had to be designed and built just to move the things. This would have been enough of an engineering marvel for a lifetime for most ships, but Impero required yet more work, such as having to have 2 main rudders, being as, during this process, the Taranto raid happened, and Littorio ended up needing Impero's rudder to replace her own damaged one. A damaged one that was promptly shipped up to Genoa for repairs before being transferred to Impero, causing yet more delays. Because not only did she have to swap rudders with her elder sister and wait for repairs of the damaged rudder, it had to be fitted by hoists guided by divers because there was no dry dock in Brindisi to put Impero in. Just think about how much work they're having to do without even basic equipment here. This is ignoring, by the by, the fact that while no damage was done to the ship, the Allies tried bombing her, repeatedly. Guess the move from Genoa was worth it, eh? It wouldn't be until January of 1940 that she was able to be dry docked in Venice, prior to her final destination. This would be the first time the ship had been out of water and able to be cleaned under the waterline for 2 years. So if anyone in the audience has any familiarity with what a ship looks like after it's been in the water for some time, yeah, imagine that, but 2 years of it. This would also be where her final 2 propellers and her 2 side rudders were mounted. Whereupon she would be put back in the water in Venice's lagoon for another 10 months. Here we reach another misstep in her construction. Trieste was already congested and busy with Roma, repairing Conta di Cavour and building light ships. There was no way it could possibly work on Impero as well. So the choice was made to, instead of sailing the ship that could now move under her own power, more or less, back to Genoa, to wait for Roma to be finished before moving to replace her in the dry dock. When she finally did get there in November of 42, work would still be slow. Not only was there a need to wait for materials to arrive from all over Italy, Trieste's dockyard was owned by a different company from Ansaldo. And in pretty classic style, the 2 companies would be constantly bickering and making swipes at the quality of each other's work, slowing things down yet further. I think you're getting the point by now that Impero just can't catch a break. So one can probably not be surprised that come 1943, and Italy getting to the point of bowing out of the war, work would be suspended completely on her and Cavour. at first to focus on even more light units, and then because Italy had left the war to join the Allies, and could not exactly build anything at all. By this point, Impero was still many months from completion. Barely any of her fittings had been mounted, and her hull was still incomplete as well. She would rest in the harbor, at least until the Germans rolled up, and promptly stripped her to the bone for a metal to fuel their own war machine, and then strapped bombs to her when they retreated in 1945 to scuttle her. Yeah, still not catching a break. She would be raised in 1946 to clear dock space, then sunk again nearby, all the while the Yugoslavians, who had occupied the city, were making loud and increasingly incessant "gimme, gimme, gimme, gimme" noises about her stripped out hull. Presumably for the scrap value, as there's no way Yugoslavia was finishing a battleship. At any rate, Impero would be towed to Venice, where she promptly ran aground, and then, after being raised, was sunk at her moorings again, and left there until 1949. She would not finish scrapping until 1950. For those keeping track, that's 11 years after she was launched. Without ever being completed, the story of Impero would end. Perhaps the most unfortunate battleship in history. Definitely the most unfortunate battleship in Italian history. But wait, there's more. During that period of let's pretend to be trying to finish this ship, there were plans. Plans to convert her into a carrier, for instance. There's, understandably, very little information on these ideas, as one could probably expect, because they couldn't even finish the ship. Converting her would have been even more effort, so yeah. Some of these drawings do look surprisingly modern for a conversion of a battleship by a nation that had never built an aircraft carrier, though. Of course, these plans never went anywhere, even in comparison to the actual construction, but they're fun to look at. For that, I recommend the Aircraft Carrier Impero book. It covers a lot of this. Again, there's not much real detail, but it has some nice pictures. The information therein is still quite interesting, though it does make it clear it was never going to amount to anything. As amusing as the idea of bootleg Italian V1s being launched from a converted battleship may be.